Hey everybody, Jem Schofield here, and welcome to the Canon R5 C for video production training series. This is part one of an overview of the R5 C in video mode. We're going to be talking about the camera body, assignable buttons, we're going to be getting into menus, and also talking about the direct touch control features of the camera. So let's get started. Let's start with the camera body itself, and we actually have two R5Cs here. One has a battery grip, which is great for stills shooters who are shooting portrait and also landscape, but we can fit two Canon batteries in here, which will give you longer record times. And then over here we have a small cage on the camera, which will rig out and add things to for video production. And if we take a look here at the back of the R5C, one of the things that you'll notice is this bump out, and it's there for a reason. We've got an intake and an outtake fan system here, which is very quiet, and it's designed to allow you to shoot with the camera in all resolutions and also all frame rates up to 120 frames per second without any limitation on record time. We also have over here on the left side of the camera body something you don't find on mirrorless cameras all of the time, which is a time code port. And it will allow us to use multiple cameras on a production and make sure that the time code matches, which is huge for post-production. Also over here we have other ports. We have over here the HDMI port. So obviously that's going to be for if you want to use it external recording, but there's a lot of internal recording options in here. And then we also have a USB-C port, which we can power the camera with if we want. There's a mic and a headphone jack. Then over here on this side of the body, you'll see here, this is where our card slots are. We have two card slots, one for CF Express Type B cards. If you've got the right cards in this camera, you can record at all resolutions up to 8K and 8K RAW and all frame rates up to 120 frames per second. The SD card slot will record in most formats with the camera system, so just check the user manual for those limitations. But really great because we can go ahead and do a primary to CF Express card B, and then to the SD card we can record not just proxies but really good quality backup files to those cards as well. So now let's go ahead and talk about this top display on the camera system. And you can see here that we have our information displayed. Assignable button number 8 over here, if I press that, it will cycle through two different screens of information. And if I do a long press on that button, it will light up, which is a huge advantage when you're on set or on location and you're in darker environments. It will let you see those displays clearly and easily. You'll also notice on the camera body there are a lot of buttons and dials, and many of them are actually numbered. We have on the main camera body itself numbers 1 through 13. That means every single one of those buttons is an assignable button, and you can give it a different job if you'd like. Most of them make sense for the video mode on the camera, but we will take a look at changing those a little later inside of the video. Now I think it's time for us to concentrate on this, which is the differences between the photo and the video mode on the Canon R5C. So now we're going to use this camera for everything that we're going to do right now. I'm going to switch this over to the photo mode on the camera system, and you will see that when I go into the menu system, I'm just going to press menu on the camera body, that we have a menu that is probably familiar to you if you've used Canon DSLRs or mirrorless cameras in the past. So it is tuned specifically to using this camera for stills capture. And now I'm going to turn the camera off. We're going to go ahead and switch into that video mode. And when I do that, you will see that everything changes. And what we're seeing here is a totally different on-screen display. And if I press the menu button on the camera, you will see an entirely different menu. And this is the menu that you find in the C70, the C300 Mark III, the C500 Mark II, essentially their digital cinema camera menu. And it gives us the options that we really look for when we're using a camera in video production. So we're going to get into some of these menus, not all of them. You can refer to the user manual for additional options. But the ones that I think are relevant to what we're going to be talking about in this training series. So let's dive into that stuff right now. So let's start in the camera setup menu. And while we're not going to cover every feature in the R5C, I do want to touch on really key things. So we're going to go to the second page of camera setup, and we're going to talk about shutter mode. If you're not used to using digital cinema cameras like the C70 or the C300 Mark III, then you may only be using shutter speed. And in DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, most of the time what we'll do is set it to a certain equation or setting. So I'll step out here, and if you look at the top right, you'll see that we are shooting at 23.98 frames per second, very standard for a lot of the capture that we do, unless we're doing off-speed recording. And then down here on the bottom right, you'll see the shutter speed, and that's set to 1/50th of a second. And what that means is we're exposing each one of those 24 rounded up frames per second for approximately half the amount of time. A 1/48th of a second would be exactly half the amount of time. And that look and feel, that motion blur, is one ingredient that we really associate with a cinematic look and feel. So if I go into the menu now and I go over to the recording media setup menu, what I'm going to do is change my base frame rate on the camera to 29.97 frames per second. Step out of there, we can see that on the top right. But lo and behold, look at our shutter speed. It's exactly the same. It hasn't changed. So if we wanted to expose each of those rounded up 30 frames per second properly, we would set it to a 1/60th of a second. So we'd have to go in, and I'm going to use the direct touch controls right now. We'll talk more about those in a little while. And I would basically change that to a 1/60th of a second. But that's slowing down production. We have to constantly think about what frame rate we are shooting in, and if we want to expose each one of those frames for half the amount of time, we've got to change it. So another example of that would be going into this menu and changing the frame rate to 59.94. We step out, we now see a 1/60th of a second. If we want to expose them for half the amount of time, we've now got to go in, and we've got to change that to the closest to half the amount of time, which in this case would be a 1/125th of a second. So now we've changed our shutter speed to that amount. Well, there is an easier way. If we go into our menu and we go back to camera setup and shutter mode, and under shutter mode, we're now going to change our shutter mode to angle. So when I select that, step out of the menu, you'll see on the bottom right, it says 180 degrees. So it's capturing light and exposing for each one of those frames for half the amount of time, the motion blur we're generally looking for. And I'll go back into the menu and change my frame rate to 23.98 frames per second, which you can see up here. And lo and behold, the shutter angle is still 180 degrees, which means that it's capturing light for half the amount of time for each one of those frames. So what's great about this, and it really takes away a user error point because you constantly have to remember to change your shutter speed if your camera is set that way, is that regardless of what frame rate we're shooting in, regular normal recording or even slow and fast motion where we're shooting at, let's say, 120 frames per second, it will still keep your shutter angle at 180 degrees. You can still go in here, though, and use the touch controls, and you can change the degrees of your shutter angle, so you still have that control you would have with shutter speed. Okay, let's go ahead now and jump back into the menus. And what we're going to talk about over in that same page that we were in before, under shutter mode, is something called Clear Scan. And you may or may not be familiar with it, but it is a big problem solver for us in production. Give you a couple of examples, and you can see down here that we have a hertz value being displayed on the bottom right of the camera. So Clear Scan is a feature where you can very, very precisely dial in your shutter on the camera, so you're matching the hertz of a device that you are either pointing your camera at, a TV screen, a monitor, or something similar where you're getting flicker or scan lines, or you're shooting in an environment where you're either seeing or you're just under lighting conditions that are not matching the hertz value of the camera, and the shutter angle or the shutter speed is not getting rid of that problem. So you might be getting flicker, for instance, in a gymnasium because there's a particular light that's not at the same hertz value as your camera and your shutter is set to. So if I go into the direct touch controls inside of here, what we can do is we can dial in this hertz value on the camera system to be very, very precise. And usually what you want to do is you want to start with a hertz value that is double what your frame rate is. So if we were shooting at 23.98, we would start at about 48 hertz. If we were shooting at 60 frames per second, we would set it to approximately 120 hertz. And then what you'll do is you'll dial that up and down until you stop seeing that flicker or those scan lines, those problematic things that are creating footage that's basically unusable. And then once you have that set, if you're using one camera, you're good to go. If you're using multiple cameras, you would just set all of those cameras to the same hertz value. Now, for what we're going to be doing this week, we'll set it to clear scan if we run into that problem in production. But for now, I'm going to set it back to shutter angle, and we're going to leave it at that for the rest of our production. So now we're going to go over to page 4 of the camera setup menu, and we're going to talk a little bit about AF, which we'll also talk about a little bit more in a real world practical application when we're on location for another video in the series. But if we go here into continuous AF, we'll see that there are 3 options. The first one is to disable the feature. The second is only around focus point, and the third one is enable. So only around focus point is pretty interesting because it's the same feature we've seen in some previous cameras from Canon, which is essentially a manual focus assist. So if you had something out of focus and you saw that it was out of focus, and we have our selectable area, and I took the ring on the camera and I started to turn it, when it starts to get close to being in focus in that focus area, it will snap into focus. So it's just an assist feature. If I set this to enable, which is the way I would normally use the continuous AF, I then have some additional options. The first one is AF frame. Right now we're looking at a large frame that we would move around the screen to get focus. We can go back in here and change that to a smaller frame, so it's more precise in terms of when it's focusing on particular areas inside of your composition. And then we have a third option here, which is called whole area. Now this is really advantageous when you go to the 5th page of camera setup and you turn on face detection and tracking. The main reason to use whole area is that it's going to be looking at your entire composition in the frame and allow you to track objects that way. You can also use it with face detection, but you don't have to have whole area turned on for face detection to work. So I'm going to step out of here, and we're going to have an object come into the frame. I'm going to tap on that object, and you can see that now as it comes closer to camera and it goes away from camera, that it's tracking that object. And I'm going to go ahead and press set on my camera, and I can change now the object that I'm tracking. Of course, that camera's not going to be moving, so I'll just go ahead and say set, and I'll change it over here to that lens again, and you can see that it's tracking. Now, there are some caveats which you need to be aware of, which is a continuous AF system or an object or face tracking is not going to work 100% of the time when you're using the camera, especially when you are in situations where you have a lot of what I call gray matter. There's not a lot of contrast in the image, and that's where you can run into problems. So don't rely upon these features 100% of the time, but they can be great and very handy for nailing focus on a lot of your productions. So I'm just going to go ahead and go back to the previous page here and change that back to large. And then there's a couple of other things that we need to look at here that you should be aware of. One is AF speed, which really just means how fast the camera is going to lock on to something with autofocus. So plus numbers means more quickly, minus numbers means more slowly. And this is really something that you would use where, for instance, you wanted to use the AF system to rack focus to something inside of the frame, and you don't want it to be too fast because it'll feel like the camera's doing all of the work and it's not a person. Because when somebody's rack focusing, it's not going to be usually snap focus, snap focus, snap focus. It's going to be a little bit slower for them to find that focus. So setting your AF speed to a lower number can sometimes be advantageous. If you were using the camera, let's say in journalistic environments, you might want to set that to a plus value because you want to just get focus very, very quickly on the different objects that you're trying to focus on. And of course, you can use the joystick on the camera to move the focus point. But what's great about a camera like this is we can just use touch focus to change our focus points as well. That's AF speed. And now we're going to go down to AF response. And this is a little bit different. For instance, let's say you're using the autofocus features on the camera and we have an AF point, whether that's a person or an object. Something passes in front of that person or that object. The response setting is really going to determine how fast the camera tries to latch onto and autofocuses on something else. So preferably, if you're trying to stay on focus on an object or a person, then you would set this response to a negative number so it didn't try to latch onto and focus on something else when it passed in front of the frame. If you did want it to latch onto something else, you would set this to a positive number. So that's AF response. And now we're going to go back to that 5th page of the camera setup menu. And I just want to talk about a couple more things. We have face AF. We can choose face only, which means it's trying to just face detect just faces when it sees them, or it just gives priority to faces. So there may be other things in the frame and then it's latched onto something and then a face comes into the frame and then it tries to latch onto that. Eye detection on or off, obvious in terms of whether or not you want it to try to track the eye. This is probably, when we're shooting people, the most important thing to be in focus. If we have soft focus on eyes, then it's a problem. And then we have something called head detection mode with 2 options. And those options are detect from face/head or detect from face. Detect from face is a smaller target area for the person, so it's just looking at the face. But if we choose detect from face head, if the person's turning away from camera or you see the back of their head, it should still lock onto that. As with all of these features, the best thing you can do is try them before you go out on a production. You'll start to feel out which parameters and which settings work for you, and then set up the camera for your particular productions. So that's part 1 of an overview of the video mode and camera controls and the camera body in the R5 C. Make sure you check out part 2 and the other videos in this series where we go on location and use this camera in a real-world production environment. As always, the goal is education, so thanks for watching.